I'll just say a few words about Sunny before he starts. So Sunny is a PhD candidate in the Institute for Medieval Studies here at the University of Leeds. He's funded by the University of Leeds' 110th anniversary scholarship, and his doctoral thesis examines veterinary and animal care in the later Middle Ages through the development of a tradition of horse care treatises stemming from De Medicina Equorum by Jordanus Rufus. Have I pronounced that correct?
Rufus. Yeah. No.
He was a horse farrier in the scientifically vibrant court of Emperor Frederick II. Sunny's central argument, which is of clear relevance to our discussions today, is that cultures of healing and care for humans and animals overlap significantly in the Middle Ages, and that they should be approached using roughly the same methodologies, theories, and ideas. Alongside his research, Sunny is organising the Medieval Bodies Ignored conference, which will be held in Leeds from the 3rd to the 6th of May this year, and he's also the co-founder of the Leeds Animal Studies Network. The title of Sunny's paper for us this afternoon is One Should Desire Goodness Over Beauty, Utility, Disability and Occupational Health in Later Medieval Horse Medicine.
Thank you. Just take that slide so I can advance the slides. Super. Hi, thanks to Ryan for organising all of this and inviting me to speak. Thank you all for coming. As Ryan said, I work at the intersection of animal studies and the history of health, two fields which, for those of us working on the Middle Ages, can seem a little bit isolated. The history of veterinary medicine, for instance, is usually thought to have started around about exactly 1791 with the formation of the Royal Veterinary College, or 1762 if your research is far-ranging and includes France. Complex ideas around health, medicine, care and disability, especially when associated with animals, are often thought to be totally disassociated with the Middle Ages, because these concepts are considered inherently modern, and the Middle Ages is the epitome of the pre-modern. As such, I thoroughly enjoy coming to venues like this to talk about what I do and to give a broader and more nuanced impression of the Middle Ages and the work that medievalists like myself do to demonstrate the applicability of medical humanities, disability studies and the history of medicine to the so-called pre-modern Middle Ages. By way of introduction, my soon-to-be completed thesis examines veterinary medicine and animal care in the later Middle Ages. And I consider the broad range of healing options available to medieval horse carers, the experiences of horses as non-human patients, and the representation of the variety of individuals and groups involved in horse care in the later Middle Ages. So, in the period that I study, horse medicine was remarkably analogous to human medicine. Its written texts utilised broadly the same biological theories and ideas as human medicine, and it was influenced by the same natural, philosophical and scientific discourses. Horse medicine was pluralistic. It made use of miraculous and magical remedies alongside surgical and pharmaceutical procedures. Horse medicine practitioners, who are known as marshals, formed a distinct occupational identity, and they often attained positions of some status. They formed guilds, and they were sometimes regulated and licensed by municipal, royal or other authorities. In short, horse and human medicine were overlapping systems, remarkably similar in form, theory and method, and they should be studied using the same methods, theories and ideas that we apply to the history of human health and medicine. My thesis is focused on a collection of didactic horse care manuals that flourished in the later Middle Ages, as Ryan said in my introduction. These texts stemmed from the work of Jordanus Rufus, who was working in the mid-13th century as a knight farrier, is the word that he applies to himself, so a suggestion of occupation and a suggestion of status. Working in the court of Emperor Frederick II of Sicily. Jordanus' treatise was translated widely and distributed very widely, and it sparked a whole genre of horse care manuals. These are far from being merely a collection of illnesses and remedies. They're more like a fully formed normative schema of breeding, domestication and maintenance intended to construct a particular type of elite noble horse around the principles of utility, beauty and bonitas, which is goodness. These principles were used to construct a model normative horse body, and by implication therefore they demonstrate a range of disabled bodies. The construction of the horse body is mirrored in contemporary healing narratives, which use beauty as a byword for value and constructed ugliness, monstrousness, and deformity as disabling. The horse body reflected the ideals and anxieties of medieval people. Concepts around status, gender, station, occupation, and sexuality were all mapped onto horses, and the animal was supposed to reflect the rider or user. Just to give a few examples, the destrier or warhorse is an expensive, well-bred, well-trained, well-maintained, and noble animal. It was presumed to be male and uncastrated, and it was understood as refined, loyal, bellicose, and capable of feeling sadness and loss if its owner dies, particularly in battle. So it's a direct reflection of its owner, and to the extent that they would dress similarly to their owners. On the other end of the social scale, the ava, or farm horse, was a crude, cheap, unrefined, ignoble, and common beast, not suited for civilised society, and understood as a taxonomically separate animal to the warhorse. I'm reluctant to use the word species because in a medieval context that is anachronistic, it's not really a distinction that they made, but this was understood to be a radically different beast to the warhorse, almost a distinction of species. Riding the wrong horse could be humiliating. The knight Gawain in Percival is forced to ride a rancy, which is a low-status sort of workhorse, by a wicked girl, who follows him laughing and saying, "I only wish that it was a mare that you were riding, because a female horse is the only thing more shameful for a knight to ride than a farm horse." It's a common topos of late medieval historical writing that a knight, lord or king who's humiliated in battle and has to flee will be forced to ride a shameful horse, a common horse, a nag, a cart horse, or a mare. Horses stood as representations for their riders. For instance, in this image, the war horse is part of the knight's chivalric milieu. It's similarly accoutred, and it's kneeling with its head bowed in supplication, copying the body language of the knight, its owner. It's part of the knight's presentation of submission, fealty, and loyalty to the king. If we compare this with the illumination accompanying the Office of the Dead from one of the Brotherton Books of Hours, the equine beast, I realise it's not abundantly clear, but the equine beast that Death is riding is blackened, has horns, a serpent-like tongue, and vicious carnivorous teeth. Both of these mounts are representations of their riders in terms of their bodies and of their behaviours. As J.J. Cohen and Susan Crane have demonstrated, the horse in particular was a powerful tool by which the expectations and identity of medieval people could be expressed. The physical body of the horse was understood and used as an analogue for the body of its owner, such as when Robert de Broc cut off the tail of one of Thomas Becket's mares on Christmas Eve 1170 as a precursor to Becket's assassination. I argue that these expressions of identity through horses could easily have extended to medieval concerns surrounding fama or gossip, idoneity, which is the outward physiognomic representation of a person's goodness or suitability, and physical deformity. This means that the elite horse ideally had to be beautiful and free from physical defects because it reflected and was a conduit for the condition of its rider. This paper will consider the ways in which ideas about health and illness were modelled onto the horse's body, how the body itself was constructed by veterinary texts and health narratives in terms of physical ability, impairment, beauty, and deformity. All of these factors contributed to ideas of the animal's value or worth, which were often constructed around the idea of fitness to work. This paper will demonstrate the efforts made to combat deformity and to enhance aesthetic appeal through cosmetic procedures, and it will also comment on the tensions between writers over the relative importance of beauty and goodness. I'll be focusing on a set of hippiatric, that's horse medicine, texts from later medieval Western Europe, and I'll be drawing comparisons with healing miracles taken from later medieval hagiography, miracle narratives, to demonstrate how veterinary treatises and health narratives all contributed to the construction of disabled and able-bodied horses through the interpretation of infirmity, impairment, and deformity. I'll start with an example. In a miracle attributed to St. Wulfstan from around 1220, a man named Eustace of Powich returns to the field where he tied up his horse to find it horrifyingly deformed. Its head was terribly swollen and blackened, such that Eustace could hardly recognise it as his own horse. He surmised that it had been attacked by some serpent or vile-smelling worm in the grass, rendering it so horribly deformed that, in the words of the narrator, you would have called it a monster. Its eyes and lips were swollen into the likeness of 2 black loaves of bread, and its head rendered so heavy that its distended lips brushed against the ground. This notion that your horse will be assaulted by a noxious beast whilst it's out grazing is quite a common anxiety in veterinary treatises, which often represents sort of a tarantula or other animal in the grass that's going to mess up your shiny, perfect horse. Eustace was distraught at this state of affairs for 3 key reasons, 2 of which are directly voiced by the miracle compiler, and 1 which is implicit. Firstly, he believed that the animal would shortly die. Secondly, he'd poured almost all of his wealth into the animal. And the third, implied cause for Eustace's distress is the state and status of the horse. In this narrative, the horse goes from a pristine white state, explicitly described as health, to a monstrous, distended and deformed state before being healed by St. Wulfstan, through the intercession of Eustace and returning to its former pristine status. The transition between states presents the unstable categories of health, impairment and disability, which for non-human animals have not really been explored in the Middle Ages. When constructed around animals, these categories often intersected with notions of value and fitness to work, which were themselves not stable categories. A low-status farm or industrial horse was defined by its strength, its stamina, and its unimpaired physical ability, whereas the occupational health of a high-status, perhaps noble horse might also be assessed according to its behaviour, its appearance, and its freedom from physical deformity. To Eustace, the fear that his horse might die is only as great as the horror that his horse had become deformed. Concerns around appearance, deformity, and elite horses are presented by each of the principal horse medicine texts that I'm focusing on today. There's Jordanus Rufus, who I mentioned earlier. His text, though relatively short, is highly influential. You can see echoes of his material deep into the 17th century, and he's really the progenitor of this entire genre of manual. In relatively short order, his text is commented on and elaborated by other writers. The 2 principal additional writers I'll be talking about today are Teodorico Borgognoni, who was Bishop of Cervia in northern Italy, and wrote both a famous human surgery manual and an expansion to Jordanus' treatise towards the end of the 13th century, so you can see how the overlaps with human medicine begin to occur. And finally, I'll be talking about Laurentius Rusius, who was stable master to Cardinal Napoleon Orsini, and wrote a much expanded treatise in the early 14th century that was particularly influential in Italy and Iberia. These writers are specifically interested in elite horses. There's very little about cart horses in their work. Each of their texts formed a cohesive normative schema on the development and maintenance of elite horses, constructed around various principles relating to value, merit, or function. These principles were expressed by Teodorico and Laurentius as 4 key attributes: form, beauty, colour, and bonitas, or goodness. These are principles taken from the Roman agronomist Palladius, transmitted through Isidore of Seville, who's a 7th century encyclopedist. Neither of these forebears do a particularly good job of explaining precisely how these 4 ideals can be applied to measuring the value of a horse, leaving the hippiatric writers, the veterinary writers, to fill in the gaps. This led to a certain amount of tension between texts over the relative importance of beauty and good behaviour. Teodorico discussed the notion of physiognomy, which was intended to transcend beauty and allow one to judge the behaviours and probity of the horse from the disposition of the body, at least in theory. And from this, the value or merit of a horse could be estimated. What Teodorico actually did was form a collection of the hidden signs of impairment and indicators of ugly or unsatisfactory behaviour. When one of the horse's eyes is raised and the area above its pupil is turbid or cloudy, or when the horse does not move one of its eyelids in response to you standing at its flank and moving your hand swiftly, then its sight is impaired, and it should be considered a cyclops, in his words, which diminishes its value. Teodorico also described a sign for night blindness, if the horse is not afraid in the night of something that it fears during the day. This also diminishes the value of a horse, as it cannot see at night. Teodorico made the distinction between what he calls evil faults and ugliness. stating that concave, cavernous eye sockets do not constitute an evil fault, a malum vitium, but will render the horse ugly to a pen. There's a discussion to be had over the moralising of the term malum or evil in that context, but it's not one for today. In contrast, a horse with white eyes is of significantly limited value, as it will not be able to see in the snow or in cold regions. A horse whose ears are flung out backwards is deaf, but when the ears of a horse hang down and backwards, it is ugly, but no less valuable because of this. Finally, a horse which does not whinny, cry out, nor make any other noise with its mouth is mute, but is no less valuable for this. It's interesting that Teodorico distinguished between impairments of utility, such as muteness and blindness, and impairments rendering the horse ugly or disfigured. Ears flung out backwards or blindness reduce the horse's capability. Ears hanging downwards render it ugly. Muteness does neither and is actually quite beneficial. There's no good circumstance for a veterinary right in the Middle Ages under which a horse should make any noise, which is interesting in of itself. In contrast, Laurentius Rutius, the slightly later writer, noted that often a horse is ugly, malformed, and the wrong colour, and yet it is a perfectly good horse. Because a horse ought to be held dear due to its goodness, because one should desire goodness over beauty. He goes on to say that utility and goodness are more important than beauty, and that usefulness and goodness excuse a horse of ugliness. Although as a caveat, he does note that if beauty can be had alongside goodness, this would be better still. Beauty, in terms of pulchritude or form, was understood by the Hippiatric writers according to two principles. A precise set of bodily specifications which when collated would run into the many, many dozens, and a lack of blemish or deformity. Deformity might be caused by disfiguring illnesses or through birth defects, which the Hippiatric tradition described as illnesses that arise naturally during the generative process through some defect or chance. Petrus Crescentius, an early 14th century agronomist who borrowed heavily from Jordanus Rufus, described the treatment for a defect of nature, namely back legs which are bent inwards, impairing motor action. He notes that it, like other birth defects, cannot be treated through medicine. Instead, he describes a process of scarification, burning 3 lines on the inside of each hip close to the testicles, so that the developing horse will walk with walking with inward bent legs will cause the developing horse pain and therefore correct its gait. Deforming illnesses, sensory and motor impairments, whether apparent at birth or acquired later in life, all diminish the value of the horse. An ailment called morphea or albedo, which causes a whitening inflammation around the horse's neck or eyes, is described by Petrus as rendering the horse ugly, even though it does not diminish its ability to work. Horses suffering from crepatias, an incurable ailment, were little valued because of their repulsive appearance. The particular association between appearance and value is borne out in healing narratives. The early 14th century miracle collection of Louis of Toulouse includes 2 miracles in which value is equated with beauty. A certain Rican of Marseille had a palfrey, which is a high-status riding horse, described as very beautiful but gravely sick. And in another miracle story, William, the horse doctor to the King of Sicily, has a certain horse described as very beautiful but terribly infirm. These couplets sort of function to describe that the horse is worth a lot and has great value and is greatly valued, and yet it's infirm, and therefore this is a horrible situation to be in, worse than if the horse was ugly. There's a coefficient here in terms of status. Low-status horses were more likely to be described in terms of their implicit physical value. A Roncy, a low-status workhorse belonging to Greta and Raymond Pauli, living in the Marseille burgh of St. Clair, was described not in terms of its appearance, but its value to their family and livelihood. When the horse becomes infirm, a Greta stayed up all night wailing and crying because she recognised that without this horse her family had nothing. The horse is described as suffering so much in its shin that it could not move, with the implication being that it could not provide labour. Following a greater supplication to St. Louis, the Roncy's return to a state of health is signalled by its return to work, carrying grapes for Raymond in the Greta. However, motor and sensory impairment are of course still pertinent to high-status horses. A warhorse from the late 13th century miracle collection of Thomas Cantilupe was described as being extremely expensive, blind, and afflicted with severe infirmities in its feet and legs. The implication here is that an expensive but severely impaired horse was valued enough to merit treatment. Another horse from Cantilupe's collection was led to Thomas's shrine, having been blind in both eyes for some time. The Hippiatric treatises, having first suggested that a blind horse was essentially worthless, also offer a number of remedies for cataracts, moon blindness, and other visually impairing ailments. So there's a certain contradiction here in terms of the assessment and treatment of impaired animals. And there's a lot of evidence more generally to suggest that although long-term illness, impairments and deformities were deemed disabling and diminished the value and functionality of horses, these animals were still cared for and various pathways of treatment were explored. The socially disabling potential of physical deformity is demonstrated by the narrative I opened this paper with. Eustace is horrified that his horse has become deformed, and the narrator implicates the audience in the assessment of the horse's disability. If you had seen it, you would have called it monstrous. This is what Luke Demeter has recently referred to as spectaculum, the horrified initial reaction to a disfigurement or deforming illness. Eustace's horse is presented in two states: the pristine whiteness, akin to bleached linen, which it returns to after treatment, and the horrifying, monstrous state which illness has rendered it to. The extremity of Eustace's reaction, the severity of the horse's condition, both speak to the great fear of deformity. The miracle explicitly links health with beauty, stating that Eustace kept making the sign of the cross, i.e. kept treating the horse, until the horse's head had recovered its pristine slimness and health. Health is linked explicitly with beauty, whilst monstrous deformity provoked terror and disgust. Even relatively minor deformities or deviations from aesthetic norms were subject to corrective measures. Jordanus Rufus described two ailments, known variously as murus or celsus and glandulae testudines or scrofulae, from which we eventually get scrofula, which caused unsightly excesses of flesh which needed to be removed through surgical incision or by using caustic chemicals to burn off the superfluous flesh. Procedures like these could themselves disfigure the horse. The Hippiatric writers noted that this procedure, as well as the treatment for cankerous or cancer, and many others, meant that the hair around the affected area rarely, if ever, regrows. This concern is reflected in the very common procedures for regrowing a horse's hair. Teodorico Borgognoni described a method for regrowing hair lost due to burning away festering wounds, noting that the lack of hair makes the affected area appear deformed. The bald skin, left by either an infirmity itself or by its treatment, would have stood as witness to this, marking the horse as both previously infirm and as currently deformed. So this paper has been an attempt to begin modelling the expectations and understanding of health, illness, impairment and disability for non-human animals in the later Middle Ages. The association of merit or value with both the unimpaired physical capacity for work and the unblemished horse, acting as conduit for the expectations of its noble owner, have both meant that an occupational health paradigm yields positive results. Within these concerns for the health and bodily well-being of horses, there's almost always a nod to value, merit, or capacity for labour. The idea of health in opposition to illness falls flat, in favour of a complex assessment of impairment, behaviour, appearance, and physical deformity. The horse's body, its behaviour, and its languages were all encoded and constructed to define its fitness and its status. So I haven't today discussed the application of ideas of patient agency or the dynamics of care, both of which could develop this argument and are present elsewhere in my thesis. The discourse today has been almost entirely unidirectional. The interpretation of horses by humans, without considering, for instance, the articulation of suffering through horse behaviours which were coded as bad or indeed evil. As such, this paper could very much be described as the practitioner's view of horse impairment. However, there is scope for an animal patient's view. By combining the human construction of animal health, illness and disability with the animal's non-verbal articulations of suffering, I've tried to create a model of medieval animal disability. From there, I've tried to unpick the lived experiences of impaired animals, remaining aware that they will always be projected through a lens which crosses the space between species. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you very much for kicking us off, Sonny.